The whole story of Priya Prishnakar building the amazing Angkor Wat complex seems like a story of someone who was taken by extraterrestrials, given a special education.
You can really pick up the relief there, you see, Giles? And from that basis, you can draw the actual stratigraphy.
How could one of the world's most famous temples be hiding something so unsettling beneath it? Angkor Wat has always looked calm and perfect from the outside, but new scans exposed a sealed vault that hasn't been touched in 900 years.
Geometric pattern imposed on Angkor Wat means that Angkor Wat is placed around the axis of the world and is the axis of the world.
What researchers found inside wasn't treasure at all. It was something far more disturbing. The rise of Angkor Wat. In the flat plains of northern Cambodia, Angkor Wat rises out of the trees like a giant stone mountain. But 900 years ago, it wasn't a tourist landmark or a picture on a travel poster. It was a gamble by a real king in a real empire. In the early 12th century, the Khmer Empire was at its peak. From its capital at Angkor, it controlled huge areas of mainland Southeast Asia and sat on rich rice fields and trade routes. The king was Suryavarman II, a battle-tested ruler who spent years expanding his borders and securing his throne. He wanted a temple that would freeze his power in stone and carry his name into the age after his death. That temple became Angkor Wat. It began as Suryavarman's state temple and planned tomb, and it was first devoted to the Hindu god Vishnu, not to the Buddha you see there today.
Angkor Wat was built in order to worship the gods, and some have suggested that Angkor Wat may be a representation of Indra's heaven itself.
The site was not a random jungle. It lay just south of the old royal city, close to existing canals and roads, so that the temple sat inside a living, managed landscape rather than in the middle of nowhere.
Even a small road from 1,000 years ago, even if it's completely overgrown, you can still see the trace of that road.
Seen from above, the shape is simple and bold. A huge square moat wraps around an outer wall. Inside that wall, a raised platform carries 3 rising levels of galleries, courtyards, and stairways, all leading to a tight cluster of towers in the center. Everything is laid out on a straight east-west line. Unlike most Khmer temples, Angkor Wat faces west, which many researchers link to Vishnu, a god tied to the west, and to the idea that this was also a place for the king's spirit after death. The big idea behind this layout comes from an old picture of the universe. In Hindu and Buddhist stories, there is a sacred peak called Mount Meru, the mountain at the center of all worlds and the home of the gods. Its top is heaven, its slopes are where spirits live, and the flat lands and seas around it are the world of humans. Temple builders in India and across Asia turned this idea into architecture, using tall central towers to stand in for the mountain itself. Angkor Wat is one of the clearest versions of that idea. The 5 main towers stand in a pattern with 1 tall tower in the middle and 4 at the corners, like the 5 peaks of Mount Meru. The walkways and galleries around them form one level after another, rising from the outer world to the inner holy space. The closer you walk toward the center and the higher you climb, the closer you are meant to be to the realm of the gods. The outer wall is about 3,360 feet long on one side and about 2,630 feet on the other, and it stands roughly 15 feet high. The temple grounds cover close to 500 acres, making Angkor Wat the largest religious structure on Earth. Outside that wall lies the most striking feature, a moat that is about 620 feet wide and a little over 3 miles around, like a square lake dug by hand. On a symbolic level, that moat is the cosmic ocean that surrounds Mount Meru. For visitors in the 12th century, stepping onto the long causeway into the temple was like crossing the sea from the human world into the home of the gods. The pale sandstone blocks used for Angkor Wat were cut from quarries on Phnom Kulen, a low mountain range about 20 or so miles to the northeast of the temple. Field surveys have found dozens of old quarry sites in those hills, with cut faces and half-finished blocks still in place. Researchers think workers floated many of the blocks down to Angkor on canals and rivers, using the wet season as a natural transport system. Estimates vary, but some teams suggest that builders moved somewhere between 5 million and 10 million sandstone blocks to complete the main temple. Each block could weigh as much as a small car. They had no steel cranes and no engines. Instead, they likely used wooden sledges, rollers, earthen ramps, and huge teams of workers pulling in rhythm, the way people still move heavy loads with ropes today. The temple walls are not made of solid sandstone through and through. In many places, the core is laterite, a reddish, iron-rich stone that is easier to cut, with a skin of fine sandstone stone on the outside where the carvings had to be crisp and detailed. Builders used some mortar and metal clamps, but a lot of the strength comes from gravity and very careful cutting. In many joints, the blocks sit so closely together that a knife blade barely fits between them. Once the main structure went up, artists covered it with stories. The inner side of the outer gallery carries some of the longest stone carvings in the world. These are bas-reliefs, shallow scenes carved so that figures stand out slightly from the flat wall. One long panel shows the Battle of Lanka from the Ramayana, where Prince Rama faces the demon king Ravana. Another shows the Kurukshetra war from the Mahabharata, where two related clans fight to the death. On the south side, a huge carving shows Suryavarman II himself in a royal procession, with lines of soldiers, court officials, and foreign visitors, followed by rows of 32 hells and 37 heavens. On the east side, one of the most famous scenes shows the churning of the Sea of Milk, where gods and demons pull on a giant serpent to stir the ocean and release the drink of immortality. In that single band of stone, 92 demons pull on one side and 88 gods pull on the other. Scattered all over the temple are thousands of female figures known as apsaras and devatas. These are heavenly dancers and guardian women carved in stone. No two are exactly the same. Their jewelry, hair, and poses change from wall to wall, which means carvers were not just copying a simple pattern. They were building a crowd of divine faces around the king, like an audience frozen in time. There are also quieter details that suggest the project did not go perfectly smoothly. Archaeologists have noticed staircases that seem to have been reworked, walls that change style halfway along, and corners where the stone direction suddenly shifts as if builders changed their minds in the middle of construction. But once the temple was finished and the king who built it was gone, Angkor Wat began a new life of its own, shaped by new rulers, new beliefs, and everyday people who lived around it. Angkor Wat through war, belief, and rediscovery. After King Suryavarman II died, other rulers took over. In the late 12th century, the city was attacked by a rival kingdom from the east, and a new king named Jayavarman VII rose to power. He strongly supported Buddhism. Over the next few centuries, worship across the region slowly shifted from Hindu gods to Buddhist practice. The building itself changed with that shift. The central room, which once held a large statue of Vishnu, was sealed with new stone walls, and those new walls were decorated with tall standing Buddhas. Other images of Hindu gods were taken down, reused, or quietly cut away, while more and more Buddha figures appeared inside rooms and along the galleries. Even when the royal court later moved toward the south, the big temple did not simply fall empty. Buddhist monks stayed on, shrines were still used, and pilgrims kept coming to pray. For local people, Angkor Wat was never just an abandoned ruin in the jungle. It sat at the edge of rice fields, fish ponds, and small villages. Families planted rice in the wet season, used nearby pools and moats to catch fish, and walked up to the temple on holy days to leave offerings or ask for good harvests. Children ran up the outer steps, vendors set up near the gates, and small wooden spirit houses appeared close to old stone doorways. At the same time, people treated certain corners of it with deep caution. In Cambodian belief, Nagas, powerful snake spirits, guard water and mark important borders between one realm and another. Along the main bridges at Angkor Wat, long stone railings carved in the shape of multi-headed Nagas line the sides of the path. For villagers, these were not just pretty designs. They were a clear sign that you were crossing into a space ruled by beings you could not see, where careless behavior could bring bad luck. Stories passed down through families added another layer of warning. Older people talked about patches of ground that sounded hollow when you stomped on them, or stretches of wall where the air felt heavy and cool, even on hot days. A few places were simply avoided after dark. Monks told people not to sleep near certain walls, not to dig near some corners, and not to joke loudly when walking past particular doors. Some workers who helped repair the stone later said they felt suddenly ill after hammering at the wrong place, or that their lanterns kept going out even when there was no wind. Others swore their chisels seemed to bounce off certain blocks, as if the stone itself did not want to open. Whether or not every story was true, the message was simple. Do not disturb what rests under the temple, and do not chip away at sacred stone for fun. Long before any European saw Angkor Wat, news of the site had already traveled abroad. At the end of the 13th century, a Chinese official named Zhou Daguan spent about a year in the royal city. In the account he wrote after he went home, he described huge temples, wide moats, wooden houses on stilts, and crowds filling the streets and markets. To him, Angkor was not a forgotten place. It was a busy capital city with palaces, processions, and religious festivals. His report is still one of the best early pictures of life there. Centuries later, royal power around Angkor had faded. More forest had crept in, and far-off visitors were rare. Local monks and villagers still knew every path and shrine, but the wider world was not paying much attention. That changed in the middle of the 1800s, when a French naturalist named Henri Mouhot traveled through Cambodia. He was mainly interested in plants, animals, and insects that he could send to museums in Europe. Guided by local people, he crossed rice fields and swampy ground, pushed through thick brush, and followed narrow tracks that wound through the trees. When he reached Angkor Wat and saw the towers and long galleries rise out of the greenery, he was stunned. In his notes, he compared what he saw to the greatest temples of Greece and Rome, and even wrote that Angkor was more impressive than the famous churches of Europe. Those words, along with his sketches, were published after his death and caused a sensation in Europe. Mouhot also noticed details that later fed into mystery stories. As he explored the walkways and dark inner halls, he saw passages that came to a sudden stop at smooth, solid walls, as if some doorways had been carefully sealed. In some spots, later builders had filled in openings with packed stone and mortar. He sketched what he could, but he did not have time to measure every odd corner, and not all of his drawings survived. With rising European interest came more organized work. In the early 1900s, the French government created the French School of the Far East, a group of scholars and engineers whose job was to study and care for monuments across Southeast Asia, including Angkor. Their teams began to clear thick roots and trees from roofs and walls, copy hundreds of stone inscriptions, and put fallen blocks back where they belonged. They tried to keep at least one temple, Ta Prohm, in a jungle-covered state to show visitors how strong the forest could be. But around Angkor Wat itself, they cut back the trees to protect the structure and make it easier to reach. Even without modern machines, early engineers could tell that something under the stone was not behaving well. Some galleries leaned outward a little more than they should. Fine cracks spread along ceilings and doorways. Parts of the western causeway and nearby banks had sunk and broken, and had to be rebuilt more than once. Old photographs from the early and mid-20th century show sections of the causeway that had collapsed into the moat and later been put back together. In the rainy season, damp patches crept up the walls as water rose in the ground. In the dry season, the same spots eased back, leaving salt and flaking stone behind. Slowly, people started to see a pattern. When water levels changed below, the temple above felt it. By the late 20th century, Angkor Wat had become a national symbol, a site on the World Heritage List, and one of the most visited places in Southeast Asia. But it was also known as a complex structure sitting on sensitive ground. To understand it fully, researchers realized they would have to stop looking only at the stones and start paying close attention to the whole landscape that held them. The hidden city around Angkor Wat. For a long time, people who studied Angkor only had one basic view of it: a big stone temple in the middle, with a few giant reservoirs and canals around it. They could walk the paths, sketch the moats, and follow broken ditches through the fields, but they were still guessing how the whole system fit together. In the 1960s, a French archaeologist named Bernard-Philippe Grolier looked at the scattered maps and said something bold for that time. Angkor was not just a group of temples. It was a hydraulic city, a city built around a giant water system that fed its people and kept the kingdom alive. What he meant was simple. The old Khmer engineers had dug huge man-made lakes called barrays, wide moats, long canals, and earth walls that acted like dams. In the rainy season, these caught and slowed the floodwater. In the dry season, they released it bit by bit into rice fields. One famous reservoir, the West Baray, is almost 5 miles long and about 1 1/3 miles wide, and when it was full, it could hold roughly 14 billion gallons of water. That is like a small inland sea built by hand. A matching lake, the East Baray, lies to the other side of the temple region, a little under 5 miles by just over 1 mile across. Together with smaller ponds and channels, these works turned more than 400 square miles of flatland into an engineered farm landscape. The idea worked, at least for a while. With water under control, farmers could grow a lot of rice, sometimes more than one crop a year in the best areas. That food paid for everything else: the workers who cut stone, the people who served in the palaces, the soldiers who guarded the borders. But there was a big problem. Much of this network lay under jungle, villages, and modern fields. A few canals showed up in photos. Others were lost in the trees or buried under centuries of mud. Researchers could map bits and pieces on the ground, yet the full shape of the city stayed fuzzy. The real change came when archaeologists stopped relying only on cameras and started using lasers from the air. They turned to a tool called LiDAR. LiDAR is a laser scanner strapped to a helicopter or small plane. As the aircraft flies back and forth, the scanner fires millions of tiny pulses of light toward the ground every second. Most of those pulses hit leaves and branches, but a small part makes it all the way down to the soil or to buried stone features. Computers then strip away the leaf hits and keep only the ground hits, building a clean three-dimensional map of the surface under the trees. In the early 2010s, a team led by archaeologist Damian Evans used airborne LiDAR over the Angkor region. In just a few hours of flight time, they mapped hundreds of square miles that would have taken decades to survey on foot. When the data came back and the images were processed, the results shocked almost everyone who had worked there. What had looked like random bumps in the jungle turned into straight embankments. Empty clearings became perfect grids of house mounds and ponds. Lines that no one had noticed before turned out to be old roads and dikes. The picture was no longer a temple in the forest. It was a whole low-density city spread out over well above 1,000 square miles, with rice fields and waterworks woven between neighborhoods. By counting these ponds and mounds, and comparing them with what is known about how many people each household pond could support, recent studies suggest that the greater Angkor region may have held somewhere around 700,000 to 900,000 people at its peak. That would make it one of the largest cities on Earth in the medieval period, bigger in area than many modern capitals. Once that wider city came into focus, researchers zoomed in on the area right around Angkor Wat. On most tourist maps, it looks like a single big complex inside a square moat, standing alone. The LiDAR map told a different story. Outside the eastern side of the main temple, the lasers picked up the traces of an extra enclosure, a planned rectangle that lined up neatly with the temple's axis. Inside that zone were rows of small mounds and rectangular ponds. Archaeologists now think many of these were house plots for priests, workers, and support staff tied to the temple, along with small shrines and work areas. One of the strangest things the LiDAR picked up lies just south of the temple. There, the ground forms a huge, perfectly shaped earthwork, more than 1,500 yards long and about 660 yards wide, built from long, narrow banks arranged in tight, winding lines. Nothing else quite like it is known from Angkor. It may have held gardens, fields, or some kind of ritual space tied to processions around the temple, but for now, its purpose is still a mystery. LiDAR does not see underground. It only shows the exact shape of the surface. To understand what was happening under the temple itself, archaeologists combined the new laser map with older core samples, narrow drill holes sunk into the ground, and careful studies of how the moat and drains connect. Those tests showed that Angkor Wat does not sit directly on natural soil. It rests on a man-made platform made mostly of sand and laterite. That platform holds roughly 3 million cubic meters of fill, which is about 106 million cubic feet. The builders shaped and packed that fill before they raised the main walls and towers. Inside it, they built retaining walls and laid out channels that link the platform to the moat and nearby ditches. In other words, they built a giant raft of earth and stone, then used water to keep that raft stable. When the water table under the temple rises in the rainy season, the platform helps spread the pressure. When it drops in the dry season, the drains in the moat help keep the ground from shrinking too fast. If they had simply stacked heavy sandstone on raw, wet soil, the whole structure would have cracked and sunk long ago. The scans could show the city under the trees and the platform under the stone, yet they could not tell what the original builders actually placed inside that foundation. To learn that, archaeologists had to start sending signals directly through the heart of the temple itself. Inside the hidden chamber under Angkor Wat. By the late 1900s, people who worked on Angkor Wat were starting to worry. Some galleries were leaning a little. Fine cracks were opening in pillars and walls. Parts of nearby temples like Bayon had the same problem. The stone was old, the ground below moved with the seasons, and simple patch jobs were not enough anymore. Engineers and archaeologists had one big rule: do not tear the temple apart to see what is inside. So they turned to tools that could look through stone and soil without cutting. One of the main tools is called Ground Penetrating Radar, or GPR. It sends short radio waves into the ground and then listens for the echoes. Hard things like buried walls send back a strong signal. Softer things, like wet sand, send back a weaker one. By running the antenna slowly across the floor or courtyard, you can build a slice-by-slice picture of what is hiding below. In other tests, teams run a small electric current through the ground to see which parts are damp and which are dry. At some sites, they also use very sensitive gravity meters that can detect tiny changes in gravity, which can reveal an empty space underground. When researchers used these methods at Angkor Wat, one of the surprises did not come from the center, but from the courtyard. A project led by Till Sonneman and others ran tight GPR grids across the western side of the temple enclosure. On the screen, the radar lines showed clear, blocky shapes 1 to 6 feet under the surface. The corners and straight edges match the standard footprint of small Angkorian towers known as prasettes. These ghost towers are not standing anymore. There are no walls, no door frames, nothing you can see with your eyes, but the bases are still there under the soil. The pattern they form is a 5-point layout, 1 central base and 4 at the corners, what archaeologists call a quincunx. The study showed that an earlier group of towers once stood in the courtyard and was later taken down, probably when the outer enclosure wall and western gate were built in their final form. Under the grass, there is an older layer of shrines that were partly demolished, then covered and forgotten. Modern scans and a few small test digs brought them back into the story. The most famous hidden feature, though, lies under the highest point of the temple. In the 1930s, a French conservator named Georges Trouvé was given permission to lift the paving stones in the central sanctuary, the upper shrine that once held the main statue of Vishnu. Under the stone floor, he found the mouth of a narrow shaft. He dug carefully, lowering workers and tools straight down. The shaft was filled with sand and water, and he had to brace the sides as he went. In the end, the team went down more than about 75 feet from the top to the bottom of the cut. At some point in the past, someone had already broken into this shaft and taken whatever large object had once been placed at the bottom. Trouvé didn't find a big statue or a chest of gold, but he did find something smaller and very important. Set into a block of laterite, the reddish building stone used all over Angkor, he discovered 2 thin, round pieces of gold leaf. Each one was a little over 7 inches wide, and together they weighed a bit more than 2 ounces. These were not random scraps. They were a sacred foundation deposit. In Khmer building practice, especially for royal temples, it was normal to place special objects deep inside the structure when it was first blessed. These could be gold sheets, small bronzes, beads, or jars with offerings. They were not meant to be seen again. Their job was to tie the building to the gods and to fix the king's act of building into the spiritual record. Trouvé's find proved that Angkor Wat followed this pattern. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.